Tonight. It's a pleasure to I'm going to take you on a journey about this exhibit, which is I guess we're about 10:30. We're not in the 11th hour yet. The installation time frame is we just put a date on the calendar for early April to bring the whales in, but the history goes back quite a bit longer than that, and it is my pleasure to share with you. Well, I'm going to cover the techniques involved in how a whale goes from a dead animal on the beach to being suitable for display in the Cultural Museum. I also want to give a little context to my background, why I think this is important, and how we're going to talk about photo ID, which is the process by which animals are identified, individual whales in these things. This is a paramount technique that is used today to study live populations of whales. It's analogous to some of you who are old enough, I see, to have watched Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom. I love that show growing up, particularly when they tag in the animals from the helicopter. But what I allude to there is the tagging of the animal. Photographic identification is a technique by which we can recognize an animal without putting tags on due to natural pigmentation. And it's very much central to this, my own story in Maine. I think Maine's story, its place in whale science, which is huge for those of you who don't know, and I hope to share that a little bit too. So we won't be all bogged down in which kind of glue and what temperature. Will you be running the slides for me? So
I absolutely can.
I'll just say that that's just a picture from the Nantucket Whale Museum, and that's Moby Dick. Not really, but about in 2000, I believe, is when we did that. The town of Nantucket asked me to present Moby Dick in the Nantucket Whale Museum. This was a giant milestone in my career, and that's my brother and I working on that many years ago, and it is the logo for my company. But next slide, we'll get right into it. So my background, I came to Maine in 1987 to go to undergraduate school at the College of the Atlantic. I was interested in whales, had grown up in the 70s, and conservation was a big deal for me, and in particular, Save the Whales was the icon of conservation in my childhood and something I wanted to pursue in college. And as I was directed towards the Naval Academy and had flirted with going in that route, I had the right sort of resume back then. I had the body to make the physical marks, but I learned that a gentleman by the name of Steve Katona taught at this little private school on the coast of Maine in Bar Harbor. And when I learned that, I knew who Steve was because he had written the book of the Whales of the Gulf of Maine, which was the definitive field guide of that time. And I, who viewed education as an apprenticeship, really, that my decision was made for me. What would I do in the Navy when I could go be Steve's student? And so that's exactly what I did. Is without much knowledge of the state, I moved up here in '87, and I haven't looked back since. I've been here for well over 30 years now. It is my adopted home state, and I'm very lucky to live here. And it's for the opportunity to work with animals like this. This is Mount Desert Rock, Maine, a notable cultural treasure in and of itself in the state of Maine. It's the most remote lighthouse on the eastern seaboard of the United States. And I mean significantly remote. It's 26 miles offshore, due south of Mount Desert Island. And it was constructed first in the 1830s, but then the current tower that you see there was put up in 1847. And this was for two important reasons. There was a local desire to have a bellwether or a navigation point from which to make a turn when heading east out of Boston into the Frenchman Bay area. But not insignificant, in that time, the 1800s, the early to mid 1800s, all shipping traffic that would have been headed to Europe from the continental United States would have left via Eastport, Maine, and would travel down east, as you all know, with the prevailing winds to get your last provisions in Eastport, Maine, before heading then east to European destinations. And if you chart a sailing course out of Boston Harbor to Eastport, what you'll find is there's a rock right there in the middle of the way. And that was not an insignificant reason for the desire for the federal government to think that this would be a good place to put a lighthouse. I don't know if any of the lightkeepers thought that, because it is like I say, very remote. Its closest distance to land is 12 miles. That's another island. And so, but one of the things that's been wonderful in modern history is that there are very productive waters in this area. So I will say that that's the state of Maine. It is, you have to travel federal waters to get to this island. But once you get to this island, it's in the state of Maine. The land is in the state of Maine, as is the 3 miles of water in demarcation around the island. And it occurs in a place of bathymetric interest of the 50-fathom contour. So the Gulf of Maine is not a very deep body of water. The Gulf of Mexico and the Gulf of California even are much deeper on the terms of 19 to 20,000 feet deep. And our own Gulf of Maine, which is very notable in its square footage of size, is not very deep, about 1,000 feet. It is deepest depths, and we didn't have it until the ice receded after the last glacial period. The moraine is George's Bank. Some of you will recognize that term as being the fabled George's Bank of cod history, and really the reason for America, if you will, it was what King George was most interested in, was right here in the state of Maine, our fishing and timber resources. Of course, we all know today how important those are. But this Mount Desert rock is on this edge of contour where the Gulf of Maine does get to. To the east and south of Mount Desert Rock is the Jordan Basin, our deep water in the Gulf of Maine, and inshore, the 20 miles inshore, we would consider coastal Maine. So this is a unique asset then, because it is out there in what is truly considered a pelagic environment. That is, it is out of the coastal zone. Its weather is not affected by land per se, and its fauna and ecology around it is one that you would see more typical of the deep ocean. And so, but where's a perch of an island right here, and for many years the College of the Atlantic has used that as an observatory for marine mammals, starting from about the time of the 1970s, 73 was the first season that we went out there. And in those days, that was still a manned station by the U.S. Coast Guard. I should just say quickly that all lighthouses in the United States were operated by civilians, by the Civilian Light Service until about the end of the 1930s. And then in the ramp-up in the time preceding World War II, it was understood that there may be coastal defense initiatives that would be associated with lighthouse stations, and the civilian staff, which had run these, so you could think about in the early days, this place was stationed by families of lightkeepers would have their wives and children with them. I should note that that's just a 3-acre outcrop of granite that sits up in the top of the ocean. There are actually 2 mountain tops. One reaches the surface, Mount Desert Rock, and another ledge about a quarter mile to the south. It gets to about 18 feet deep at a low tide. But with that need for coastal defense initiative, all of the lighthouse services will need to into the Coast Guard's display. And then eventually, as we get into the 80s with automation, they begin to not be present. But back in the early days, students could only go, no female students allowed. They couldn't cohabitate with the Coast Guard wing. The Coast Guard was all done at Mount Desert Rock by about 1984. The college's whale research program is in full swing by this point. We've identified that Mount Desert Rock is an important place to see really all of the species of whale that you can see in the Gulf of Maine. Less the sperm whale, which does come around from time to time, an important one from the whaling aspect. So a wonderful ecological field station, if you will, directed at whale studies. And this next slide. That was too long for this one, so I'll leave it just a little bit. What's important about Mount Desert Rock as it relates to this photo ID I alluded to is that the technique for recognizing whales based on patterns that they have, pigmentation patterns, was done right here in the state of Maine and at the College of the Atlantic. Another fabled whale researcher, the late Dr. Roger Payne, made famous for understanding that it was male humpback whales that sung. Think of humpback whales as being the singing whales. And he would have discovered that by sticking microphones in the water in the Caribbean. And he happened to take a picture of one of those whales that was in the Caribbean. He assumed it was a breeding ground, but nothing was really understood about whale populations. And he had shared that picture with students at the College of the Atlantic working on tuna. And they were able to match that whale from Salmon Bay in the Caribbean to right off of Mount Desert Rock. And that was the very first time that a whale was ever recognized in photographs. And in doing so, it over a long distance, unlocked the important migration of the humpback whale between its feeding locale here in the Gulf of Maine and its breeding area in the Caribbean. Next slide, please. This picture gives you an idea. This work was done by recognizing the underside of the tail. The humpback whale lifts its tail to dive. It's a pretty robust animal and buoyant, and it has to get its tail up out of the water to get its angle steep. And in doing so, it lifts its tail. And one of the students, when looking from the lighthouse tower, was able to recognize that each of these whales had a distinctive pattern on the underside. And with some rigor and some science, we were able to determine that that is as viable as a fingerprint. And with a good picture of the underside of the tail, you can recognize a humpback whale. And for a good chance to recognize it, of course, it's across the course of its entire life. And so whales are long-lived. Humpbacks may live 100 years, and they acquire marks. Sometimes you can see things like tooth rakes from killer whales and other sorts of things. But in short, they range from an all-white pattern to an all-dark pattern. We call that code 1, code 5. And this is much what the cataloging looks like, individual pictures of whale foods that are then compared. Next slide. I should say that this is just a little comparison to prove to you that you can match them. There are two whales in that set of 6 that match each other. And I'll give you just 20 seconds to see if you can recognize them, and then which two are the same. And then you can just give you a little taste of what it would be like to be an undergraduate researcher at the College of the Atlantic, where you pore over catalogs of thousands of pictures of whale with a fluke in your hand. Which one does it match to in the catalog? And sometimes, of course, it doesn't. Next slide on. I hope everybody got that. Just put on these little dots right here, and these little hack marks here, and numerous other minutiae that if you were to look at that, you would convince yourself that there's no chance that that's pictures of two different animals. Okay, with that, you understand how photo ID works. And it has been extended to different species of whales over the years, sometimes looking at different parts of the bodies or different types of marking. But suffice it to say that with whales, this sort of recognizing of individuals based on pictures happened right here in the state. Next slide. My work is with finback whales. Bernard had complimented me on my whale lapel pin, which is a finback whale. This is a very little known species. It's fairly abundant in our waters. It is the second largest of all the whales, second only to the blue whale in our understanding of any mammal or any kind of creature that's lived on the earth. That they can grow in this hemisphere to about 70 feet. They're a little bit larger in the southern hemisphere. These whales are found all over the world. A streamlined and very evasive critter, does not lift its flukes out of the water, does not wave at whale watch boats. Hard to capture the imagination of the public because of that, but I thought that was perfect for me, so I dug right in. And this is most of my work, next slide please, is working with the photo identification of this whale. So we won't get into the technical of this, but I'll just point out in this picture here, you see a large scar on this animal and different shapes of dorsal fins, and those are the techniques that we would be using as identifying characteristics. So this took me in learning about individual whales' life history, natural life history research. So we're tracking an individual over the course of its season or over the course of many years, as it turns out. Some of our whales have been seen for 30 years or more. And by doing that, each time you have associated metadata with the sighting. Was it seen with other whales? Was it swimming? Was it breeding? What was it doing? What's habitats? Next slide. This took me into my interest in genetics. This is where I went at graduate school in the University of Maine. Techniques had developed in the early 90s by which you could take a little piece of DNA from a skin sample. So the skin is taken by a modified crossbow. You take a little bow and arrow and you shoot it into a whale. Well, first you get that little research permit, but then you shoot the arrow into the whale. You grab a piece of skin which is just about the size of a pencil oration. And then we can take a multitude of DNA out of that and using molecular techniques that I won't get into, study that animal, both inside of itself, what its own genetic makeup is, and also how it relates to other whales in the population, other species of whales. All of this information is encoded in the DNA. And so once we get the DNA, it is a very powerful technique for learning about animals. Next slide. Again, this work, as I did it in graduate school, was based for Mount Desert Rock, a little better sense of what the island is like here. This is the lighthouse station and the lighthouse itself, a little boathouse and a generator shed, but not much else. The College of the Atlantic owns this facility since 1994, when Maine was the lead in the nation to dismiss lighthouses out of the federal service. So at that time, post 9/11 and with new Homeland Security mandates, the Coast Guard wasn't much interested in taking care of historic structures. Mount Desert Rock, like many lighthouses, are on the historic registry, and they're important to people like you and I, but the military service had less interest in that. And so, through Congressional Act, the Maine Lights Act, Maine was the pilot place in America for seeing whether or not you could dismiss these facilities to would-be stewards that would use them gainfully. Most often, this is another government agency. The Fish and Wildlife Service is prominent, and many of these islands, as they're home to seabird nesting colonies and things like this, or other NGOs, such as the College of the Atlantic, had interest in continuing to use this as a whale field station and to expand it into other sides of natural history research. I figured so much on this because I really need to tell you that putting whale skeletons together is not a side gig for me, but it's another gig for me. And one of the things that I am proud to be associated with is as the facility manager for this estate. And so I have, to this date, been involved with very many renovations out there and even built some of the buildings that occur on the island. But I find that it grounds me, it puts me in a long lineage of caretakers, people who care about culturally significant items. And this is not a place that's very accessible to the public. It's not that you could never get ashore there. There are a few opportunities through the College of the Atlantic to do that. But it's arduous. There's no dock. You land on a boat ramp and crashing surf, and can really appreciate the hardships that these Maine families, from husband, wife to children, lived in these conditions. Sometimes a visiting school teacher lived in these conditions and did important work. And today we feel the work is important because of its educational and research opportunities. And also the state and national government recognize them for the cultural significance. So it really is an honor to be entrusted with this. This relates to whales because I feel the same sort of stewardship over the whale skeletons that I do. Next slide, please. As part of my work at the College of the Atlantic, I'm involved in strandings. This is what we're going to real. There is a little death in this PowerPoint. So what I should say is all whales and marine mammals, seals included, have been protected in the United States of America since 1971 and 1972 under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and some of them under the Endangered Species Act. And so there is a mandate to respond to all of the dead ones federally that end up on the beach, with the purposes being to collect information on what they are and where they're occurring and any other biologically significant data that can be extracted from them, and to understand what had killed them and whether or not there is an anthropogenic cause to them. So I got involved with this work very early on. It is, of course, dynamic because large animals, dead animals on the beach that you don't ever get up close to if you're a zoologist, this is the kind of thing that is fascinating. And so I really did dig into this. Next slide. But I also had an interest in comparative anatomy. As part of my education in undergraduate school, I learned things in museum, practicum in museum technologies, learned how to do taxidermy and build dioramas, and most importantly, interpret the natural world for people through the museum's interpretive perspective. And so that's very strong and powerful, and Strandon's put those associations together for me. Next slide, please. And I started in 1993 doing whale articulations professionally. I do business under Whales and Nails. It's actually in ink now. And I used to say, and still do sometimes, that whenever we're doing more whales than nails, business is good. That is to say, as I alluded to with my capacity as a facility coordinator on a field station, I'm pretty good with a hammer and with building techniques generally. And so that is definitely part of my background, not just the knowledge of whales. A couple of specimens we've had on display in Chicago. This one here at the Phillips X-Ray Academy, notable because it's a humpback whale, our subject for our exhibit, but much smaller version of it. Next slide, please. So this is more of what I had said about my background. I should say that this very famous finback whale skull, which sits along the building at the College of the Atlantic, is where I got my start in all of this. That was sort of haphazardly put on campus before I was a student there. And when I was a freshman, the facility people hit it with a snowplow. And I thought, well, that's not very good. And I decided to build a display out of it. Was able to do so as an independent study. So I earned the credit to build that exhibit that you see there, which stands to this day, doesn't look quite as nice over the rigors of time, but it is where I first engaged in this as a thing, as a coach, a vocation, let alone my vocation. Next slide, please. A couple of pilot whales there on display at the New Hampshire Seacoast Science Center, which is in Rye, New Hampshire. This is where this humpback is on display as well. This is just a partial list of exhibitions that I have been involved in. But this last one is notable. This is, you can't see it in there, but our Governor Mills is in that picture someplace. That's at the recently opened Maine State Aquarium in Booth Bay Harbor, associated with the Department of Marine Resources Scientific. They're located in Booth Bay Harbor. And they've just gone over a similar remake of their museum, closed since the pandemic, and addressing new facilities there. So let's go forward to the next slide. Part of the background of this is conservation, and I really always saw myself as a very serious scientist. Wouldn't get on a whale watch boat, didn't want to be a naturalist for tourists. I wanted to learn about whales, but at some point I understood that in the museum context of exhibit building, you have an opportunity to educate the public in ways that I had not really truly appreciated. Number of anthropogenic concerns, the whales in the Gulf of Maine. We've heard a lot about ship strikes, and I'm sure you're all familiar with the very controversial landscape that we're in regarding whales and fisheries in our state, an emerging energy sector in our state that wants to use the ocean landscape, and these are all issues. But for me, when it was started, it was really believed that shipping was a big problem, and it was. Whales die as a result of ships. They can also be entangled in things like this. Next slide. But what I'll say is this awareness that has led to real change, at least for the shipping industry. This is the Boston shipping lanes, and they used to look something like this. This is simple science where we plotted, not me, but the Stellwagen Bank Sanctuary and other researchers plotted whale sightings, and it was determined that you could find a path of ship entry into an important harbor which mitigated or decreased the direct interaction with whales. In the case of many whales, they cannot tell where the direction of the sound is coming from very well. Their ears are not really much different than ours. They're not totally designed to work underwater. They require an airspace around them. And so directionality is not good. And so it turns out if you can't hear the ship, you don't really know where to go to get out of its way. And so other techniques then, can you move shipping lanes, affect speed, etc. to mitigate them? Go forward. Ship strikes are a big concern, often fatal, but not always. When they're not, they leave scars on the animal. That's helpful. Next slide. And smaller boats can be a problem, not just because of direct impact by skippers who may not be attentive at the wheel, but also because of a general cluttering of the ocean. We put more and more sound in the ocean, we use the ocean in different ways, and of course, whenever we have a dense environment, we have those opportunities for nature to interact in a poor way with humanity, and so that's a concern. Next slide. This brings me to Stumpy, a right whale. Important because our story starts with a right whale, and I'm going to get into that in just a minute. But Stumpy is an important right whale trapped by the New England Aquarium for over 35 years and known to have many calves. North Atlantic right whales, I'm sure this group understands, are a very threatened and endangered whale. Globally, one of the most endangered large whales, and they lived almost exclusively here in the Gulf of Maine and along the eastern seaboard of the United States. So this was a project that we had done. This animal struck twice by ships in her life before becoming, on the next slide, an exhibit at the North Carolina Museum of Sciences. This is their Nature Research Center, and the exhibit very much deals with the science of studying whales, but that was a whale that was a ship struck on when. Next slide. Again, I refer to her as being an important whale, important scientifically, but also important sentimentally. And that's because in identifying these whales year after year, and we're reliant on the whale watch industry that goes to areas where whales are and takes pictures of them, people become to know them, and they become the beloved relatives or your summer friends that you see. This was a project that we did in Glacier Bay, Alaska. This whale was hit by a cruise ship, but not before it was known for some 35 years, also having a number of its calves. Next slide. Now let's get to our story. And it starts with Engo 3694. That's a female right whale that was killed as a result of emaciation. What's noticeable about this, not only that it is our start of our story from putting a large whale skeleton here at the Maine State Museum, but also, unfortunately, this whale died of entanglement, which you may have heard on the news or in other circles doesn't ever occur in Maine waters. But this whale in 2016 was dead just off of Blue Bay Harbor and landed in Portland and taken to a Gorham landfill, where its necropsy was done to determine its cause of death. Unequivocally, that had starved to death due to the entanglement, which you can see here is being roped near the head of the animal and binding tightly, and pretty catastrophic entanglement would have led to a quick demise. Next slide, please. Just a little bit of orientation for those of you not familiar with right whales. They're the rumtum whale, no dorsal fin, known as being the right whale because they were the right whale to kill during the heyday of Yankee whaling. They yielded a lot of barrels of oils and they floated and they were dead. That was most important. And so you could kill them, wonton, and leave them to float and continue to hunt for days if need be. And then you could simply, when it was all over, go back and collect the floating carcasses. What the old whalers would do would stick a flag in the floating carcass of a dead whale that would claim as belonging to their boat. So this is at a time when whales were commodity. What's important from the perspective of the photo ID is that the recognizable parts are actually pelosities, which are like warts that grow on the animal's head, and they're highly infested with cyanids, which are a crustacean whale lice, which is eating the fluffy skin on the head of right whales. It turns out those crustaceans are just as endangered as the whales because they're the only species that eats the skin of right whales. The New England Aquarium and also the Center for Coastal Studies in Provincetown, Massachusetts is involved in this work, and they've done a lot of work to describe how you can look at these callosity patterns and tell them apart. Next slide. I think we can do it too. These are two pictures from the New England Aquarium's catalog, and these whales are swimming away from us. This is the blowhole of the right whale. This is the arch of the lower lip, the lower jaw of the whale. So both of these whales are in the same swimming dynamic, and as you can see, this pattern of warts and the white stuff is the whale lice, little crustaceans climbing all over them that go on those. Those are stable and individual, so recognizable just like the other side of a fruit. Next slide. Back to our picture here, just to remind you of this and to use that illustration before to orient yourself. These are the long baleen plates, which the animal has instead of teeth. It is a filter feeder, and those callosities then will be up here on the top of the nostril. Next. Edna was a 10-year-old female. That's important because I've mentioned this is an endangered species. And whenever you have an endangered species, you're interested in reproduction, and that means the females are the important ones. Now, a right whale would not become reproductively mature until about the age of 12 to 15 years. So this young lady never had a chance to contribute her genes into the next generation. This is Engo in life, what her callosities look like. This is a picture of her from a NOAA airplane where they do these censusing work using aerial photographs. And this is at the landfill, of course, at her next autopsy time. And we never really knew her to have calves, but suffice it to say, she spent a lot of time in the Gulf of Maine, ranging from the Great South Channel up to the Bay of Fundy, and was had a substantial number of sightings that would be a reasonable number of sightings over a pretty short 10 years of life. Next slide. This is what she looked like at the necropsy, and this rope was not used to tie her to the trailer. That is the fishing line, not ever equivocally determined to be Maine fishing line. And so just briefly, parenthetically on that score, understand and appreciate that there is a federal lobster fishery and there is a state lobster fishery. And these are two different fisheries. And while they're conducted very similarly, some of the gear is different. So just because this whale was found dead off of Maine waters does not mean that she died in Maine fishing. That is true that you hear in some of the discussions and debate around this particular issue, but I think we can all agree to be wrapped up in line would be very difficult to live with. In the case of this particular was mortal and pretty quick. She was sighted in February with no gear on her in that aerial picture I showed in the last slide, and she was found off of Blue Bay in September. So in a short period of time, she had encountered that gear, became entangled in it, and demised pretty quickly. And it was probably not a matter of months, weeks. That's okay. Just a little bit of a map of the range. This is the Gulf of Maine here, and this is the primary range critical habitat for the North Atlantic right whale. In its lifestyle, it would be feeding in our nutrient-rich waters on little tiny plankton, copepod, zooplankton, and they breed and have their calves, or I should say have their calves, they breed in between here at higher latitudes, but they have their calves off of Georgia and Florida. And their migration route takes them then back and forth between these two places, and that is pretty congested waters. Scott Krause, who is the progenitor of the humpback whale work that I mentioned, photo ID here in the Gulf of Maine, later in his career, he's now retired, went to the New England Aquarium, where he perfected this photo ID technique on right whales, which helped us unlock mysteries such as this. Just a little bit of note about this body of water, Gulf of St. Lawrence, just because you'll hear it in this political dialogue surrounding fisheries and the risks to right whales. Right whales feed on this plankton, the zooplankton I mentioned too, a copepod, which is a cold water organism. And probably most of you are aware, the Gulf of Maine is warming very rapidly. It's in the top 5 of ocean bodies of water that are warming up. And we believe that in the Gulf of Maine, we've already experienced from 4 to 5 degrees of Fahrenheit of warming. That is a huge magnitude of warming. And what that means is that animals that we're used to knowing in the Gulf of Maine are leaving the Gulf. And they're leaving for colder waters. And this includes the copepod, an important food for the right whale. It includes our American lobster, which is a cold water critter, and also moving east into Canada. We've probably seen some political ads aimed at Canadians and the interaction with our local lobster issue. This has been an effect for the right whales because the right whales have followed their food. And starting about 2017, we started to notice that a really large percentage of the population was going to the Gulf of St. Lawrence in the summertime as opposed to the Gulf of Maine. This happened at exactly the times this politics around all of this was brewing. And so you'll hear lots of things like there are no right whales in Maine waters. They've moved north to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And while that trend is a true statement, it is not true that there are no right whales in the Gulf of Maine. And in fact, there was just a really good sighting of them some 20 miles off of Bar Harbor, about 40 animals in an area where they were historically known to be on the Greater Minigan Banks, and so they still frequent Maine waters. Okay, next slide. I should say that Houston, we have a problem because this is where we started. We collected this right whale. I had met Paul O'Rourke, who's curator at the museum. I think about 10 years ago, we collaborated on a project called The Whale That's on Display in Ferry Beach at the Beach Research Center. And at that time, she had asked me to, she thought I might have the skill set to help with the project in the museum. And that is when I came and first met Bernard and the team at the museum. And Bernard had a wonderful idea about getting a large whale on display in the Gulf of Maine. This was some 8 years ago on my recollection. And that right whale was the one that I pointed Paula to as being the perfect animal. The museum had done an awful lot of work to get the federal authorization needed to have that and possess that skeleton. And then I was sent to go collect it from where it was rendered in a compost facility. These are the remnants of her bones. And unfortunately, the people who disposed of that whale and rendered it into bones didn't realize it was going into a museum exhibit. And the composting that occurred around it was very, very hot, a seafood compost, a place where they get rid of crab waste and crab shells and things like that. And the heat inside of composting, this is where we're going to get technical, is really important to how you preserve what's in it, right? In a very hot compost pile, bones are digested. And when we got the bones out of this pile, they looked okay for a few days, and then they literally started to disintegrate before our eyes. And it wasn't for some time that we realized that was because of the heat. They had been subjected to a compost in about 6 weeks, 6 to 10 weeks period of time, and many of the bones were very damaged. Too much, I thought so, to be a good candidate specimen for this great exhibit that I talked with Bernard and others about at the museum. And that was because we would spend a tremendous amount of money on labor, glue, paint, and putty, making the whale, whatever you've ever heard the saying, paint and putty make what the carpentry isn't. And the same could be said, we could build the whale just like a dinosaur from a couple of fragments, but that wouldn't be the authentic display that we wanted to show. And so as tough as a pill as it was, probably for some people in the room here to swallow, upon my best advice, we moved away from that as being our pristine whale skeleton. Not to worry, we do have a couple of exhibits. We're going to present the lower jaws and the pit and the flipper, which are in decent shape. So we're not going to lose Engo's story here to the extent we want to interpret. But I had another problem, which is I had this great potential client in my home state of Maine, and I really wanted to see this exhibit, but we didn't have a whale. So we had to come up with a whale. Well, some years earlier, we had collected a humpback calf in May of 2012. This is a very small animal, died in May. She would have been a calf of the year, probably born 5 months earlier in the Caribbean. She had made it as far as the Cranberry Isles off of MDI with her mother, and then she was found dead on the island. We do not have the cause of death for her, but she was collected, and I was very excited to have the calf specimen because they're rare. You don't often get to see that developmental stage, so that was wonderful for me. And we used to say in the biopsy, when we would biopsy whales, you'd be interested in the genetics of mothers and calves, and we had permission to take skin from calves. But it was very important in the research setting to get your biopsy sample from the calf first, because if you shot the mom with a bow and arrow, she was taken off with the calf, and you were never going to get anywhere close to that calf. And they're very protective, and they'll position themselves between your research bow and the calf. And so there was something to the research that spoke to me about this specimen. If I have the calf, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could present a mother-calf pair? There's nowhere in the world where there is a mother-calf humpback whale on display, where we can see the entire range of growth from when they are as a juvenile to this immense size that they grow. And I had the calf, and so I was looking very much for a companion and thinking about the Maine State Museum for it. Next museum. What is so wonderful, this is the calf skeleton. And I just want to point out here, these are vertebrae of the spine. And one thing that you'll notice here, this is the spinous process, and this little hole that goes through here is the neural arch. So that's where the spinal cord goes, and these larger part of the spine is the centrum, or essentially the scalp of the backbone of the animal. Very important for all vertebrates. As part of development, this is not one bone. These are actually separate bones that then fuse or ossify as the animal grows over time. And this particular calf at 5 months old demonstrates this with absolute certainty that ankylosis, that's a scientific term for the bones hardening, is ossified on certain vertebrae, but in others she was still gapped. This would have been a cartilaginous gap in the vertebrae. And so we have a skeleton that has been captured in time at a point of its development, which is very unique and illustrative of that development, and I thought a pretty incredible teaching tool. So I was just really excited to have this specimen and thought someday I'll find a perfect venue for it, and I think I'll. Thanks, so. That brings us to VET. Part of my work at the College of the Atlantic is helping other stranding groups clean their freezers. So you collect these dead animals, seals, dolphins, large whales. The smaller ones end up in freezers, and on necropsy, that's a post-mortem investigation to determine the cause of death. At some point, you have to clean out the freezer. And I have been cleaning out the freezers for the eyeball group. These are the stranding representatives on Cape Cod. They work well in the Gulf of Maine, but they're down in that part of the world, that part of the world. The two stranding authorities here in the state of Maine are the Marine Mammals of Maine, located in Brunswick, and the College of the Atlantic, located in Bar Harbor. But I had been cleaning the freezers for the eyeball group, and I had been sort of bugging Misty Nehmeyer is the person in charge down there about looking for a large humpback whale female. I wanted a mother humpback, and when she got one, I wanted to be notified because I had a good idea for it. And just a week prior to Vector's death, I had been down there collecting the freezer, and I said to my friend Misty, I'm still looking for that large humpback female skeleton. And she says, I hope I don't ever get it. And 1 week later, the animal was dead, floating off of Cape Cod, which is a well-known area to go whale watching. This is a well-known animal, cited a lot. A celebrity could be recognized immediately from a whale watch boat. And it was May of 2019. Next slide, that we go. And show here. This is the picture of her fluke underwater. This is how they knew immediately. The whale watch boat saw a dead whale. They got up close to it. They looked at the fluke and they started crying. And after it was on the boat, they knew this was that. It was like their long lost friend. We had seen her only last week talking to speak. And this is just to show that even a dead whale with its tail floating under the water with a picture, you can positively identify that individual. Next slide, please. Well, she was towed to shore and collected, and she was collected for the state of Maine, for the Maine State Museum. I got even out ahead of Bernard on this one. I went down there with my authority as a well-known whale skeleton guy at this point, and somebody who had some creds in the research community, and I went into the state of Massachusetts, which is a little odd because it's not my region, and I claimed this whale for the state of Maine because I thought it would be the perfect complement for this calf. And therefore, two pristine whales that we might present in the Maine State Museum. So I remember the press got very interested in this, and I was sure we would get the permits and this would be okay. But as I recall, Bernard was a little bit, can we say we're getting that whale yet? And I remember that when I got to the beach, I met the federal authority, the NOAA officer, at the gate going into the bankruptcy, and I had been remiss to not call them and suggest I had done all of this just with the other stranding affiliates. There is a good collaboration inside the stranding network that specimens can pass between network stranding responders pretty freely. And so I was able to collect this whale under the guise of the College of the Atlantic and bring her remains back to the state of Maine, knowing all along that I would encourage the Maine State Museum, if they're interested, to get the authorization and have Vector become the centerpiece of this exhibit. And again, remember that the people who have been working on this exhibit had really gotten used to this idea of right whale and the right whale story. They have been running with that, and so this was quite a shift. This is Vector on the beach, just to give you a little size of their scale in just post-mortem. Next slide, please. And just a little bit about, because I had a map for right whales, how the population of humpback whales work. Again, from photo ID, the Gulf of Maine here, we know that humpback whales are, for the most part, born in the Caribbean or here off of the coast of Africa, and they go to one of 5 major feeding groups. So the shortest migration in this particular life history would be whales that come to the Gulf of Maine, like Vector. She had come, amongst all her sightings, she was never sighted in the breeding ground, but we know her to have had 5 calves. This is from being seen during the summertime with her offspring swimming in close association. So in that sense, she was perfect, not the literal mother of the calf that I was pitching, but an appropriate specimen, both in size and in real life history. Talking about tangible individuals and their personal stories, I think, are moving in the interpretive sense. Next slide. Okay, so we were going to do a better job with our composting. Not that the other people did a bad job, they didn't really know what they were doing. And so they utilized techniques for disposing of the whale. And by the time we got to the bones, they were a little heavy for our purposes. This is on my farm. Here we are burying some of the large ribs. This is Vector's head and notably the baleen. I bring that up because our exhibit will be one of the few in the country that displays the baleen in the mouth of the whale where it belongs. This will, of course, make it very easy to interpret how it is that their filter feeding works. And so we're excited about that. Next slide, please. This is my assistant standing next to her head, again for scale. This is the piece of baleen that they took out of her. The scientists are, you can see they cut a nice little section of her baleen out. Well, I'm always telling people, why? You know, I once, Darlene Kenton is a notable acoustician and studies the auditory function of whales in the Boston area. And we once caught one of her graduate students with a hatchet at a whale as they were trying to remove the ear bone of a whale that I was trying to take the flesh off for a museum exhibit. And I caught the hatchet with my hand, not the blade, their hand, and I said, what are you doing? And they said, I'm collecting the ear. And I'm like, not with that. You know? So most of the time you can articulate, you can surgically remove that bone. You don't have to go in with the chainsaw. chainsaw as it was. So this is my constant struggle with the community that's trying to study this whale. I am always trying to tell them, patient is already passed, you can take your time and take them apart personally. But I thought this was good because it gives you an idea of what that baleen looks like with the skin of the animal still present. We're going to put the baleen back in the skeleton. The only place that you can see this readily in America is at the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology. Those specimens were done in the 1830s. Pretty well, I might add, but this is going to be a notable. The only place where, next slide, please. The only place where there's a humpback calf on display anywhere in the world is in Iceland. And so we will have both the calf and the adult whale. This is the putting the flippers to bed in compost, static composting. So an important part of this is we never turn the compost pile. The bones are just simply laid in a bed of wood chips and they're left undisturbed. It means it takes it a little longer to decompose. The turning is aerating a compost, much like you would do in a garden setting, and it can speed the decomposition of your garden vegetables up. But if you turn your compost pile with your whale skeleton in, you'll break bones, you'll increase the temperatures of the compost, and you damage to the bones. So we were careful to not do that. These are vector slippers as we unearthed them just a couple of years ago, and she is a lovely, pristine specimen. Next slide. This is a vector skeleton laid out at my compost facility. We see her large lower jaws here. This area would be the maw of the mouth where that baleen will eventually hang. This is pre-clean, so this is just out of the dirt, but you can see her rib bones laid out here in the middle. Okay, next slide. Now the real work begins. Just some context of where we went and these individuals that I think are important. I think they're iconic. They speak to real issues today. They are part of our Maine working waterfront and a species that I think all parties are really committed to working with. I really want to emphasize that point. I've never met a fisher that ever wanted to damage or do any harm to the whale. Now, I've heard plenty of derogatory things said in a political context about whales, and some targets put on the back of energy and the governor's office and others who are looking to do things in the interest of climate change and carbon reduction for the state, but again, impeding into those waters. And I bring this up because, particularly to this group, to acknowledge how important I think that museums and their educational aspects are. Because most people in the state of Maine have never seen a whale up close, especially for other things. And we're in a place where they not only will be able to become close and intimate, they will have access to that unbiased story about what the facts are and how important that is to our discord and to the future of how we develop the resources, the fisheries, the use of whale as an important tourist resource in our state, and development of our water states for other uses. Okay, so the real work begins because the whale bones are greasy when they come out of the pile, out of the compost pile. And I should say that whale bones are they are derived evolutionarily from a terrestrial form. It took about 50 million years, but 50 million years ago, the whales were walking around on land. So our best supposition. Their bones differ fundamentally from terrestrial mammals in their composition. So many bones are made of two different pieces. You have an outer hard enamel, call it, on the bone. This is the cortical bone. And it's what gives the bone its structural integrity to be able to hold the muscle that has to act to move the organism around. This is fundamentally important in a whale because a whale is not moving through air, it's moving through water. It would be like you and I living in an environment of mayonnaise or peanut butter, where everything you have to displace the tremendous weight of the water to move this entire mass of your body through it. And so whale bones are large because they need a lot of surface area to attach muscle to. But they can't be very dense, and they don't need to be very dense. If they were very dense, they would be negative buoyant. That's not good if you're a whale and you have to get to the surface to breathe. And importantly, the inner part of the bone, which is a larger percentage than it would be in a terrestrial mammal. If you think about a horse has to support its couple of thousand pounds on four tiny little legs, and its leg bones have to be strong enough to support that weight. A whale, on the other hand, is pretty well weightless in its environment. It's like a boat in that it displaces and it's supported by the ocean around it, but it has this tremendous energetic demand to push its body through the water. It has to push the water out of the way, and that takes this tremendous amount musculature to be able to do so. So the inside of whale bones, for those in the technical crowd that can sell this bone, is the bone marrow. That's the part of the bone that is very porous, like a catted bone, and you and I, it's filled with lipids and oil. We can derive energy from that, as do whales. But it is proportionally larger than the whale. So you have this very thin but strong enamel on the outside of the bone, and then you have this large volume of soft, mushy bone, if you will. And this is the fundamental problem. One, because we're trying to hang this thing, so we need the whale bones to be able to support their own weight. And two, all of this lipid of the bone marrow, it stays in there. And you got to get rid of it. I don't know if anybody's been to the New Bedford Whaling Museum, but they got a blue whale in there that's drip lines 20 years later out of the whale bone, and nobody wants that in the museum. So one of the large things we have to do is clean and degrease these bones. Next slide. We do this the way the whalers did, in trying the whale. So this is used like a hot water and a detergent. And essentially what we're doing is elevating the temperature of the bone, and therefore the lipids inside the bone, the fats, they turn to a liquid, and then they can migrate out of the bone. This takes a lot of washes. You wash the baby, you dry it out, you do it again, repeat, and that's what she's done. In the olden days, we would do this in big cauldrons or use modified wood boilers. Next slide, please. And then we'll, after the bones are clean, we'll have to figure out a strategy for putting them together. So that's the fabrication and articulation part. Next slide. And then eventually we have to bring them to the museum. Whales and males, we use a modular construction, and we will be using our vector exhibit modular construction. So what that means is I put the whole whale together in my shop, and then I take it apart in sections. So rather than bringing individual bones in, I'll be bringing lengths of spine, which will be 10 or 11 feet, just about the size that'll fit nicely in that freight elevator to get into that primary floor. Next slide, please. So a little bit deeper into the degreasing. This black, gray, green, nasty water right there is the oil that comes out of the whale bone. And you can associate that. That picture has smell. It stinks. It's death. And what you're doing is you're evacuating it out of the bones. And of course, pressure steam washing, and then repeat. Next slide, please. So larger bones need larger tanks, custom tanks as it were. Here's Vector's whale mandible out here getting ready to be power sprayed, and it was rendered in a tank like this during the colder period last year. So that's a wooden tank with a liner in it, insulated with foam insulation, and I've used Egyptian technique there for dragging that water and whale bone out in order to clean. Next slide, please. We're doing things a little bit more modern today. You'll recognize that as a traditional residential wood boiler. This is how I heat the water for the whales. So sometimes we'll have a whale skull. In Vector's case, her head is about 12 feet long by about 7 feet wide. That requires a pretty large tank and pretty good volume of water. And you need more than just your little, tin cooker that you do your lobsters on to get that hot. But we can do this in a very controlled manner. By pumping the water out of the tank into the wood boiler, I can have excellent control of the temperature of the water. And that's very important technically, because you can destroy whale bones by overboiling. People always say, are they going to boil the whale bones? I didn't say it, we're going to boil the whale bones. Never, 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 ever boil your whale bones. If you get them to boiling temperatures, that's temperatures that will be high enough for the proteins to denature, and when the proteins denature, it falls apart. I'm sure you've all made a broth, and it's really good when it floats and falls apart, but if it can go too far, and then of course you don't have anything. So the wood boiler is ideal because it allows me to keep fine control over the water, but also conduct this tri-works for an extended period of time. Those whale mandibles were in hot water at about 180 degrees Fahrenheit, if anybody wants my recipe, and for about 6 days, and then you can clean them up and do it then if you need to. Next slide. Okay, so just quickly building a tank for the skull and what they look like. This is not actually Vector's skull. I don't have good pictures from Vector's boiling. This was a similarly sized humpback we did for an Alaskan project a few years ago, but it illustrates the techniques of you start with the whale skull and you build the tank around it and you add the liners. And you got the next slide, please. Another one. That's what that looks like when it's going. So we've got that whale skull on its side in order to take up the minimum amount of space, right? We just need the heat from the water. We don't need that. We can use as much water as we want, but in order to control those temperatures, we want to keep the volume relatively small to what we're boiling. That's nice and sudsy there in the shop. Next slide there. This shows a little bit of what the boiler apparatus is like. Again, pulling it out of the shop. And I think the final slide will show what that slide where we're using heavy equipment. And we pluck the skull out of the tank and then go after it with the pressure washer to clean. Okay, next. And that's what we have for cleaning. So now we'll assume that the whale bones are degreased. That's important because that's where the sticky smell is. That smell will attract crows, such as insects and other things. Not only is it unpleasant to your patrons, it can be a real problem for the rest of the collection that the museum does. So these are important steps. But we want to bleach the bones. And so you can do that with hydrogen peroxide or natural sunlight. Never, ever bleach. So I said bleach the bones, but I implore you, even if you're working with your nephew on a rabbit skull he found in the wood, do not bleach it to make it white. Because bleach has chlorine. Chlorine is a negative ion, and it interacts with the positive ion of the calcium of the bone, and you can't get rid of the chlorine. It just eats the bones forever. You've seen bones that are bleached, they have dander, and they slough and that sort of. So even though I refer to bleaching, we use benign techniques. It's the UV light and sunlight which helps bleach bones, sort of that sun bleach. If you think about a bison skull you might find on the prairie, that sort of colored bone, that can be gotten by the sunlight. And you can also get there using hydrogen peroxide. Hydrogen peroxide, H2O2, so it's got an extra oxygen, and so therefore some negative ions like chlorine, it will interact with the organics that are tarnishing, staining the bone and get it to the natural bone filler. But of course, after it liberates its electron, it becomes H2O, which is water that is benign to the bone and evaporates away. No residual chemical, which is antagonistic to the bone in the future. So very important for something like a museum piece. Next slide, please. Fabrication and assembly, I find this to be the most fun part of the work. This is where I've worked with a number of talented people on idea. I always got a couple of strong ideas myself. For me, I've put a number of whale skeletons together. I find it analogous to building roller coasters. That is to say, you never do one with less loop-de-loops than the last one. There always has to be something better. We've got a lot of novelty going on in our project. There is no place that a mother and calf are on display to one another. We have this incredible oncology or developmental status that the calf is in to share with our public. And we're going to include the baby and some other things. And we're going to do also right in the context where what we know about these individual bones, the science needs for know how to that will develop here in the state. And so if there is any consolation that our focus is not on a white whale, it is that I think that the humpback whale, which in my world people consider the humpback whale the white lab rat of the whale. That is to say they've had this tracking photo identification going on for the longest. The population is robust. We really feel like we know what we're going on. They're an environmental success story. Humpback whales in the Gulf of Maine used to be listed as endangered species. They're now only threatened species. So there are one of these places where we really can point to in a lot of different ways to how science and conservation can work for preserving the natural environment. Next slide. Drilling the vertebrae, so into the weeds a little bit here. There is a skeleton inside the skeleton. That is to say, I don't want to see what's holding the skeleton. We have to use steel because you can have earthquakes and the engineers care. And so we have very robust steel that is inside the bones. These are on display. That is to say, they are not truly scientific pieces anymore. And so for those of you in the exhibit or in the museum community, they always scoff. Things that go on exhibits are just going to get destroyed. They'll drill into it and kids will touch it and whatever. And but it's such an important part of the whole education opportunity. So this is destructive articulation. That is to say, we drill holes in the vertebrae so that you can't see the steel that is later holding it. Next. And that's what that looks like. It's a little bit like threading beads on a string, but of course, it's not a string. And next slide, if you will, please. You got to bend the string into some sort of shape that is interesting. Unlike the whales that are on display at the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology, again, put together in the 1830s, our whales will be dynamic. We hope that they invoke more about their lives than their death. And so in Victorian times, it was simply good enough to present the animal in a straight, lifeless manner. This is the way. And of course, in modern day, we're much more interested in the story and in the sensation and the drama. And for me, as an artist, a sculptor, I'm very interested in how you can invoke motion in a static sculpture. And so the bending of the string then becomes very important. Next slide. Not just in one dimension, but in two dimensions. We use a pretty low-tech conventional metal bender, just simply a hydraulic jack with a number of dies that work for bending the bones, but we'll have to get it up on scaffolding in order for it to get the contours and shapes that we need that invoke some agreed upon posture amongst a lot of people. And hats off to Brewster, I believe his son's got a jazz competition today. But it's been a joy to work with Brewster on these aspects of it. It's not just my vision, it's a vision amongst a number of people who have thought about this. So a real winning exhibit is not just one where the whale skeletal articulation sculpture is tough, but it's when the gallery matches it and the interpretation and the storyline all match for the perfect experience. That's what we're after the next one. So securing the bone to the pipe, this is done with little wedges initially. So here we see about a 3.5-inch pipe on Vector here with one of her vertebrae bones, and they're initially secured with wedges. But then we use an expanding foam, not unlike great stuff. For those of you who are keeping a recipe, stuff, it expands in that space between the pipe and the bone and locks it. It's a glue, it's an adhesive, and it locks it very securely. Now our suspension whale can swing, even be violently shook by an earthquake, should that ever happen, and we know the bones are not going to separate themselves or dislodge themselves from their internal steel structure. Next. Modular connections, so just a little bit about how that works. Sort of a sleeve nipple, if you will, put on the steel of one module and the other. I really have this in here to impress upon you the amount of times we put the whale together. You gotta slide all the bones on the pipe. It's not trivial. You gotta get the spacing right. You gotta figure out where the module break is. Take all of the bones off, work with the pipe, go back and figure it out. So this is the whale will be put together 3 or 4 times before we're all done with the final assembly. Next slide, please. The rib mock-up, the ribs will not be able to be on the whale when it comes into the museum. Again, we have some constraints. That's what we were looking at closely. Importantly, where we have to start with the articulation is on a lower level. And there's a ramp and a set of stairs to get down to this lower level, about 4 feet, 4 feet lower than the entrance of the museum where we'll be bringing the bones in. And we simply do not have the space, if the whale skeleton had its ribs on, to bring them in whole. So the ribs and those sorts of aspects will be applied as part of the installation. But suffice it to say they're mocked up. We expect that will be in the gallery for about 4 or 5 days installing the 2 whale skeletons. Next. And of course, I don't want to forget the flippers, also constructed similarly to the way the spine is. That is to say that the bones are drilled out and slipped on some sort of steel core. You see steel rods in here. This is a piece of angle iron which backs that up. These are the finger bones, the phalanges. Whales have flippers just like you and I, and they have bones and digits inside of them. Interesting, a right whale has 5 digits. That's the ancestral form for all mammals, as it turns out. Even a horse had started originally as some yesteryear animal with 5 digits, and its limbs have evolved into the singular, but it's the middle digit in the case of the horse, which has turned into a hoof, and then 4 of the digits have disappeared. In the case of whales, the older of the 2 of them, the right whale, and I mean evolutionarily older, is a 5-digit form inside of its flipper, and the humpback whales, which are belenopterids, have 4 digits they've lost. For some reason, the third, in science, they say they lost the 3rd digit. That's the middle one, in case anyone's counting. So I kind of think of them as this sort of fireboy whales, because they don't even have that digit to give you the bird. But the technique here is really, the point is here is the technique is the same. This is what you can see, and we'll mask that by using a simulated synthetic cartilage to cover that steel, so that all we see is the representation of the bone appendage inside the flipper. Now, we can all appreciate that in a living whale, these bones are essentially encapsulated in a cartilaginous pad, as opposed to being attached distinctively here. But again, we're bridging and using a little synthetic here to help hide the steel and allow people to see the anatomy for its functioning. attributes. Okay, next slide. Installation, this is coming up, so these are borrowed. We haven't done this yet. I have no pictures of vector to share. This is in the this is the Nantucket Whaling Museum, there where we did the very large sperm whale shown on the front slide. This is that stumpy right whale that I referred to in North Carolina. So just a little sense that these things will roll in on rolled chassis, very much so. Next slide, please. Making the connections, just some pretty pictures, and I put this in here. I can't name all of the people that I work with. There's 93 or something. I work with a lot of college students. I was telling someone today that I saw myself as a 22-year-old until I was about 45, because I'm looking at the 22-year-olds all the time. And then eventually they start treating you different. And you're like, oh, yeah, yes, I'm not. Anyway, so I work with a lot of very young and talented people. I'm very lucky in that I was in graduate school for a very long time at the University of Maine, so I could draw on very talented students from that large pool of students, and also students from the College of the Atlantic who are closer to home. But there is a period of time for which I am able to work with a young artisan between college and whatever comes next, because most of my projects are project-oriented. It's not a continuous fabrication of whales 24/7 all year long. And so I've worked with dozens and dozens of very talented young people. I wanted to acknowledge some of this. Okay, next question. Get close here. Touch up and finish. That is to say, there's always a lot of work to do in the install where we're getting everything just perfect. Again, in our project here, we anticipate that this will take about a week. We're scheduled right now for about the second week of April. Don't hold them on to it. We've been battling this timeline for a long time. We'll do what we have to do, but we expect to be on site for about a week's time in order to get these whales in the building and up in the building. Okay, so I just want to sort of conclude on this. This is the most recent version of the hanging. And this is an homage to all of the stuff that we can't see when the exhibit is over. And that's quite literally hours, hundreds of hours of people's time, considering where the hanging points are, how much weight, what's the size of the cable, where do they tell the contractors to put the steel months before the whale skeleton is even finished. And so there's a lot of inference that has to be done here, all good design work. And this was the last iteration, our finalized design, showing the hanging points in the ceiling, for which we had to install and have the Dothan crew put in steel girders and things with eyeball attachment points for hanging the whale. But just to represent where we're going in black and white, again, our mother vector with a representative calf at her side, with a ramp where you will greet vector at her eye level, where you can experience her, or walk down the ramp to under her and really get in the whale under. She can drape just over your head at 8 feet. So a very dramatic place where you get the whale. You see the mom whale first, with the calf hidden like she would be in the wild behind her mother for security, but with a path which educates you as you immerse, almost dive into the water with the whale and really get into it. So that's where we're going. Okay, next slide, which is, I think, the most important one, which is the acknowledgement to this group and the museum in addition as well, who have been with us on this idea for 8 years, and we're now getting to the home stretch, but not without a lot of other groups. The Center for Coastal Studies, which is involved in right whale research, the Marine Mammals of Maine, who collected the right whale. Vector was collected by the Eiffel people, the calf by the College of the Atlantic, and the allied whale. The New England Aquarium Group, who spearheads the photo identification on right whales, the Center for Coastal Studies and Allied Whale working on the humpback identification project, and the other groups there that have maybe contributed to graphics that I put on display that did not site throughout a period of the piece. And with that, that's my concluding statement, and I hope I've used enough time and not too much, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about the process or where we're going. Thank you.